This may unsettle what you think you understand about wealth, progress, and the true origins of modern power. While much of early medieval Europe remained fractured, inward-looking, and economically constrained, one city was moving in the opposite direction, intentionally, methodically, and at remarkable scale. It did not stumble into prosperity. It was constructed for it. We often call this era the Islamic Golden Age, but that phrase obscures the machinery beneath the brilliance. The real driver of this surge in wealth and innovation was a precise system. The Abbasid Caliphate anchored in the city of Baghdad. Not a romantic golden age, not a diffuse civilization, a purpose-built economic engine, designed to synchronize trade, knowledge, and capital across continents. Welcome to Wealth Casebook, where money, power, and history intersect. In the year 762, a calculated decision was made that would quietly reorganize the economic gravity of the medieval world. The Abbasid Caliph Mansur did not seize an existing imperial capital or rely on inherited infrastructure. Instead, he ordered the creation of an entirely new city, one planned from its foundation to serve a single overriding purpose. That city was Baghdad. From its earliest design, it was not meant to symbolize power. It was meant to operationalize it. Baghdad was built to perform a function no other city of its era attempted so deliberately: to coordinate long-distance exchange at scale. Its location was chosen with precision. Positioned along the Tigris River, Baghdad sat near the intersection of the most critical commercial corridors of the early medieval world. To the east stretched Persia, India, and the routes extending toward China. To the south lay the Indian Ocean network, linking East Africa with South and Southeast Asia. To the west stood Byzantium and the Mediterranean basin. To the north ran access points into Central Asia. This geography mattered because it allowed movement of goods, people, ideas, and capital in every direction. But geography alone never guarantees prosperity. Many cities sat astride trade routes and remained peripheral. Baghdad's advantage was not location alone, but design. From its inception, the city functioned as economic infrastructure. Roads, canals, markets, warehouses, and administrative centers were not secondary developments. They were the core architecture. The Abbasids did not merely govern territory. They coordinated systems. Taxation was standardized. Legal authority was centralized. Commercial regulation was predictable by the standards of the time. This predictability was more valuable than charisma or conquest. It created trust. And in economic history, trust is the precondition for scale. At a time when most people spent their lives within a short radius of their birthplace, Baghdad operated across continents. Merchants arrived speaking different languages and carrying goods sourced from thousands of miles away: silk from East Asia, spices from South Asia, gold from Africa, furs from the north, glass and textiles from Mediterranean workshops. This was not intermittent exchange. It was constant. The city did not depend on a single commodity or route. It diversified long before diversification was a theory. When one corridor weakened, others compensated. When one market slowed, another expanded. Baghdad did not merely host trade. It synchronized it. This stood in sharp contrast to much of early medieval Europe, where economic life was fragmented, localized, and constrained by weak monetary circulation. Wealth existed, but it was embedded in land, hierarchy, and status rather than moving through markets. Trade occurred cautiously, often violently, and with limited institutional protection. Baghdad treated distance differently. Long-range exchange was not an exception to the norm. It was the norm itself. Sustaining that scale required more than coins. It required systems. While gold and silver circulated widely, transporting physical metal across deserts and seas was risky and inefficient. Abbasid merchants relied instead on credit instruments that allowed value to move independently of early forms of bills of exchange enabled traders to deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent value in another. Supported by trust networks reinforced through legal enforcement, capital could move faster, farther, and more safely than anywhere else in the world at the time. This system did not emerge spontaneously. It depended on clear contracts, reputational accountability, and institutions capable of resolving disputes. Baghdad provided that framework. Courts existed specifically to adjudicate commercial conflict. Markets were regulated enough to ensure reliability, but not so rigidly that innovation stalled. The state did not attempt to control trade in detail. It reduced friction so trade could function. Wealth was not locked away, it circulated. And as it circulated, it expanded. What is striking is how contemporary this economic architecture feels. Financial history often frames complex credit systems and institutional finance as late European developments. Yet centuries earlier, Baghdad had already operationalized many of these mechanisms, not as abstract theory, but as practical solutions to scale. Merchants pooled capital, distributed risk, and coordinated production across vast distances. The result was not merely wealth, but durability. Economic activity did not depend on isolated individuals. It rested on systems that absorbed shocks and rewarded reliability. Commerce, however, was only one pillar of Baghdad's prosperity. The other was something far rarer in the pre-modern world: the deliberate treatment of knowledge as an economic input. This is where the Abbasid Golden Age earns its name, and where it is often misunderstood. Knowledge was not preserved for prestige or piety alone. It was actively pursued, funded, translated, and applied because it increased the efficiency of the system itself. The Abbasids sponsored an unprecedented translation movement, drawing texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other intellectual traditions into Arabic. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and engineering were not imported as curiosities. They were integrated as tools. Improved mathematics enhanced accounting, taxation, and commercial calculation. Astronomy refined navigation, calendars, and trade timing. Medical advances reduced mortality and extended productive life. Knowledge increased output, and output reinforced wealth. Institutions such as the House of Wisdom were not symbolic repositories. They functioned as research centers. Scholars received salaries. Translators were compensated. Debate was institutionalized. This produced something exceedingly rare in medieval history: a professional intellectual class embedded within the economic system. Knowledge production was not isolated from commerce or governance. It interacted with both. While much of Europe struggled to retain fragments of classical learning, Baghdad consolidated, expanded, and operationalized it. Urban life reflected this complexity. By medieval standards, Baghdad was immense. Population estimates vary, but even conservative figures place it among the largest cities on Earth at the time. Its markets were specialized, its crafts diversified. Public amenities, baths, hospitals, schools were widespread. This was not wealth concentrated narrowly at the top. It was an ecosystem, a layered urban economy in which different roles reinforced one another. Merchants relied on scribes. Scholars relied on patrons. Officials relied on administrators. Specialization was not merely tolerated, it was rewarded. Again, the contrast matters. In much of Western Europe, following the fall of the Roman Empire, urban life contracted, cities declined. Literacy narrowed. Trade networks weakened. Political authority localized. Baghdad moved in the opposite direction. It expanded. It centralized. It connected. The result was not only cultural brilliance, but sustained economic output over centuries. This does not mean the Abbasid world was without tension. Inequality existed. Political conflict was frequent. Power struggles were real. But structurally, the system grasped a principle many societies miss. Wealth is not simply accumulated. It is enabled. Baghdad did not become rich because it conquered more territory than others. It became rich because it reduced friction. It lowered the cost of moving goods, money, and information. It made complexity manageable. This is the deeper lesson of Baghdad's ascent. Prosperity followed connectivity. Stability followed institutions. Trust followed enforcement. And enforcement depended on systems that extended beyond individual rulers. At its peak, Baghdad represented something rare in history: an environment where economic design aligned with human ambition. By the time Europe would later rediscover many of the classical ideas that shaped its own renaissance, Baghdad had already been living with them, refining them, upling the team and scaling them across continents. The richest city in the world was not defined by walls, armies, or conquest. It was defined by flows. What made Baghdad resilient was not permanence, but depth. Systems built with redundancy can survive strain. For centuries, Baghdad absorbed shocks, adapted institutions, and maintained its role as a central node in global exchange. Decline, when it began, was not sudden or dramatic. It was structural. And that distinction is critical. Economic systems rarely fail at the moment of impact. They fail earlier, when coordination weakens and incentives quietly shift. The earliest fractures appeared not in markets, but in governance. As the Abbasid Caliphate expanded, the administrative coherence that had powered its rise became harder to maintain. Regional governors accumulated autonomy. Military leaders gained leverage over civilian institutions. Tax revenues that once flowed predictably into Baghdad began to fragment across provinces. The system that had sustained trust and circulation slowly lost alignment. This mattered because larger-scale wealth depends on enforcement. Contracts function only if authority is credible. Credit flows only if defaults are predictable. Long-distance trade requires disputes to be resolved without violence. As political authority fractured, these guarantees weakened, not overnight, but gradually. And gradual decay is always harder to perceive than sudden collapse. At the same time, the Abbasid economy grew more complex, and complexity carries risk. Specialization raises productivity, but it also increases dependency. Baghdad's prosperity relied on uninterrupted flows. Tax revenues from distant regions, grain shipments along rivers, trade caravans crossing continents, and administrative competence holding everything together. When those flows slowed or diverted, the system did not immediately fail. It became fragile. Internal power struggles accelerated this process. Court politics redirected resources. Military expenditures increased. Factionalism replaced coordination. None of this eliminated Baghdad's wealth outright, but it altered incentives. Short-term extraction began to replace long-term investment. Stability, once the system's greatest advantage, became more difficult to sustain. Still, Baghdad endured. Trade continued. Knowledge persisted. Institutions adapted. For centuries, the city remained one of the most significant economic and intellectual centers on Earth. This longevity is often overlooked. Decline is rarely linear. Systems with deep foundations do not vanish quickly. They absorb shocks. They reconfigure. They persist longer than outsiders expect. The final rupture, when it came, was external, but only because internal resilience had already weakened. In 1258, Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan reached Baghdad. The siege that followed was catastrophic. Infrastructure was destroyed. Libraries were burned. Administrative continuity collapsed. This event dominates historical memory, and rightly so. But it is a mistake to treat it as the sole cause of Baghdad's fall. The Mongols did not destroy a fully functioning system. They shattered one that had already lost its capacity to protect itself. What is striking is how quickly prosperity evaporated once coordination failed. Trade networks unraveled. Credit systems collapsed. Specialized labor dispersed. Knowledge institutions lost patronage. Wealth did not migrate cleanly to a new center. It fragmented. This was the inverse of Baghdad's rise. Just as connectivity generated prosperity, disconnection dismantled it. At this point, the story stops being about medieval history and becomes about systems more broadly, including modern ones. Baghdad's Golden Age challenges a persistent assumption that wealth naturally follows conquest, culture, or moral superiority. It does not. Wealth follows structure. It follows incentives that reward exchange over hoarding, trust over coercion, and knowledge over extraction. When those incentives erode, prosperity follows. Modern economies operate on the same principles, only faster. Trade hubs thrive because they connect. Financial centers flourish because they reduce friction. Innovation clusters emerge where capital, talent, and information circulate freely. The pattern remains unchanged. Only the technology differs. Baghdad's achievement was not accidental. It was engineered. And its decline was not mysterious. It was structural. That clarity does not diminish its legacy. it sharpens Italiano. History didn't lose Baghdad because it was weak. It lost it because later stories shrank the frame. When we expand it again, the pattern becomes clear. Wealth follows structure. Power follows coordination. When those unravel, decline requires no conqueror. If this shifted how you see history, subscribe. The past explains the present. I'll help you read it and understand why systems always matter most.